Normally on this channel, I cover the budget alternatives to more expensive lenses. And this is generally a $1,000 lens or a $500 lens that you get something that gives you similar image results for say $200 or $300. But this lens is on a whole nother level. And this lens has a similar set of specs, build quality, and very comparable image quality to lenses used in Hollywood movies, big budget Hollywood productions. We're talking about cinema lens sets that cost $200,000 or $300,000 used on cameras that cost $100,000 plus. So in this video, I want to explore, can an average person buy this lens and get an image that is very, very similar to your favorite Hollywood movie? When you first look at the lens, you can see it has a very similar look to a set of lenses called the Cooke S8i. Now, these are lenses that average around $35,000, commonly used on Hollywood movies. The other set of lenses that these lenses might be a budget replacement for is the Zeiss Supreme Prime series. And those lenses average around $20,000 per lens. So when we look at the value set this lens offers, we're talking about a lens that has a very similar set of specifications, but at 6% of the price of those highest priced lenses. These are the DZO Arles line of cinema lenses, and these lenses were sent out to me at no cost to myself. This is not a paid or sponsored video, and I'm under no obligation to say anything specific about the lenses. I will put some links in the description down below to the two places that I believe will be stocking it. I'm making this video just prior to release, so hopefully when you watch this video, they will be available for sale on those couple of websites. One of the biggest features that these lenses have in common with these more expensive Hollywood lenses is they have what is called VistaVision sensor coverage. That means that the coverage of the image that comes through this lens is big enough that it covers a sensor that is bigger than full frame. This is a VistaVision format sensor. You can also use them all the way down to APS-C or micro four thirds. So this is a set of lenses that allows you to go all the way up to shoot on a $100,000 plus cinema camera used in Hollywood, but they could also be used on something like the GFX 102, a camera that shoots in VistaVision format. So if you buy into this set of lenses, you are not restricted by sensor size. There is no limit to which camera you can use. And even if you aren't going to be shooting on one of those higher end cameras, the fact that this lens has that huge sensor coverage has ramifications for the image in both full frame and APS-C, and I will kind of come back to that later in the video. In front of me, I've got the 75mm T1.4 lens, but I'm currently shooting this video on the 35mm T1.4 lens. Now, I should mention, I don't have the correct shutter speed, and I've just thrown it on there, and I haven't done much with the colors, but it is going to give you a bit of a raw idea of what the image might look like. So throughout this video, you've got examples of the T1.4 35mm lens as well. One of the most outstanding features of the lens is the build quality, and it is incredibly well built. Now, it comes with a PL mount. You've got a really smooth and beautiful aperture ring that goes from T1.4 to T22, and you also have a very extremely smooth focus ring. Now, the copy I got has the scale in feet, but you can actually change that 2 meters yourself. This is all included in the kit. And when you just have a look at the front element on this lens, you've just got these huge optics that allows you to cover that VistaVision format sensor. And if you look at the aperture, what you'll see is I think it's 16 aperture blades in total. And you get this extremely round aperture as you open and close the lens, which is why you will see later in the video that we get these round specular highlights and round bokeh balls. Now, when you see people talking about these lenses, you're going to hear them talk about how clean they are, how clinical they are, and I 100% agree with that assessment, and that is my opinion as well. But what I will say is this does not stop them from having a very specific look. And I think the images that I've been getting out of these lenses do look different than the other lenses and other cinema lenses that I have. And I've really kind of been challenged to put my finger on it. And I think a big part of this is when you shoot the lenses wide open at T1.4, there is very, very little vignette. And I think commonly with lenses that are this fast, that open up this wide, we're not used to seeing images that have very, very little vignette. So I think our brains are tuned to when we see an image that has a very shallow depth of field, we also expect there to be dark edges. And those two things go together for us. So I think that is actually a big part of what I'm seeing, because my first impressions when seeing the images is they were they seemed extra bright, or the whites seemed more white, or something like that. But I think a big part of that is just the vignette combined with this very shallow depth of field, a look that we don't see on lenses that don't have this huge VistaVision coverage. And looking at the flare performance out of the two lenses that I have access to, the 35 and the 75, they have a very, very similar flare performance. And that is, you get some blooming around the edges of bright spots in your scene, spotlights, or direct light. You get a slight bit of desaturation of the image around those bright points of light, but you don't get a whole lot of lens streaks or flare or anything going through the image. There were a couple times with the 35mm where I got it to kind of do this poppy flare as it was coming through the trees and we were doing a little bit of a walking sequence that looked quite nice. But for the most part, these lenses do their best to just remove that flare from all of the images. And interestingly, comparing this to the Cooke S8i lenses that I saw online, I think the flare performance is going to be very similar. It looks like they had a similar target in mind. Another thing I noticed is when I stopped the 35mm down and we had some bright points of light coming through some trees, you did get a very pleasing sunstar effect. Once again, it wasn't very strong, similar to the flare performance, but you did get some nice little sun stars when stopping the lens down. The close-up image quality out of these lenses is not only excellent, but it's actually closer than the comparable Cooke lenses, the $35,000 lenses. The 35mm will focus as close as 350mm, where the comparable Cooke lens is at 700mm, and the 75mm will focus as close as 760mm, whereas the Cooke comparable is at 800mm. And at the minimum focus distance with these lenses, the image quality is absolutely excellent. And I think it's one thing that does set these lenses apart from a lot of other cinema lenses out there at any price point, because close focus is generally not a strong suit of most cinema lenses. The distortion performance on both lenses is very well controlled and very clinical. The 35mm exhibits a very minor amount of barrel distortion. The 75mm exhibits a very minor amount of pincushion distortion, but in all the sample images you've seen in this video, I haven't corrected any of them. And the only time it's really noticeable is when you get some straight lines close to the edge of frame. The distortion is so minor that in those situations, you could correct it in editing and no one would even notice. But for the most part, you don't have to worry about distortion on these lenses at all. Looking at the chromatic aberration performance in both the in-focus and out-of-focus areas, there was no purple fringing to speak of, and there was no shift in color in the out-of-focus areas before and after the plane of focus. So this was a completely clinical performance and something you really don't have to worry about. Looking at the bokeh and background blur, you're going to get generally round specular highlights. When both of the lenses are wide open and you get closer to the edge of frame, you do get some of a cat's eye effect. Interestingly, when I went and looked at some of the Cooke S8i footage online, the $35,000 cinema lens, I expected they would be perfectly round bokeh balls. But in actual fact, as you get to the edge of frame on that lens, you get almost more triangular shapes. So I think the cat's eye shapes that you're getting out of these Arles Primes are actually better than those out of the Cooke S8i. And interestingly, as you stop down the Arles Primes, because they have something like 16 aperture blades, you maintain this nearly perfectly round shape of those bokeh balls and specular highlights. Whereas with the Cooke S8i, you get this very geometric shape, which I don't think is nearly as pleasing. So I think when it comes to specular highlights and bokeh balls, I think the Arles series actually outperforms the Cooke S8is. When we just look at general background blur, it's nice and pleasing and smooth, and the transition from the in-focus areas to the out-of-focus areas is really quite nice. I also think when you see an object or a person that is in frame, in focus, and you have that background behind them, you do get a bit of that interesting 3D pop where that thing that is in focus in the frame does kind of jump off the image a little bit. And at times it's almost unreal or surreal, the amount of separation and the way that in focus area just jumps out at you. I think it is a super cool look. One thing that's very important about cinema lenses is that they have a consistent color throughout the lenses, meaning that you can just leave the same settings on the camera, swap to a different lens, and the color you're getting out should look nearly identical between the two different lenses. Now, in my testing, there was a 200 Kelvin shift between the 35mm and the 75mm, with the 75mm being 200 Kelvin warmer. I did reach out to DZO, and they said that they did know this was an issue with the demo set that I got, lot. And the final version of the lenses will have no more than a 100 Kelvin shift between any of the lenses in the set, which I think is perfectly acceptable, particularly when we're talking about this price point. Looking at focus breathing, which is where the image may zoom in and out when you are drawing focus to near and far, there is essentially no focus breathing whatsoever. Even in my sort of in the studio laboratory test where I tried to identify it in a way that you wouldn't in a real world situation, I just could not see any. And of course, in real world results with real movement, you are not going to see any focus breathing whatsoever. So I would say the focus breathing performance on the lenses is perfect. And when we look at resolution and detail, the lenses are incredibly sharp. In fact, they are so sharp at times that you may want to put a diffusion filter on them and take control of that to soften skin tones and people and different looks. But right through the lenses, right out of camera, you get this incredibly sharp, detailed image, and you get that sharp and detailed image and not at the sacrifice of the background blur, because you still get this incredible, smooth, pleasing background blur, which is sometimes a challenge for lenses. Getting a lens that gives you an incredibly sharp in-focus area, but also a pleasing, smooth background blur. I think they really have nailed it with these lenses, and I struggle to find any faults with the sharpness and detail. I will also say that although it is a very clinically sharp and detailed lens, it doesn't have that super heavy-handed contrast that you often see out of the best photography lenses out there. It still does have that kind of cinema lens look that most people are looking for. So do I think people are going to forego the $35,000 Cooke S8i lenses or the $20,000 Zeiss Supreme lenses and choose these lenses over those? No, I don't. I think if you are shooting on a $100,000 camera, a multi-million-dollar Hollywood budget movie, you're just going to go with the name brand lenses you know, and that's what people are going to expect you to be using. But if you are shooting at home, if you are an independent video producer, and you've longed to get an image that is similar to what you're seeing out of those productions and those movies, I do think this is a very compelling option that gives you a lot of similar image character in a lens that is 6% of the price. And for those people, I think this is a lens that I can highly recommend.